Nazla, you're good to start.
So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for attending our panel today. It's a very timely panel. We have very distinguished speakers. Just a short update on what happened this week in case you missed it. The Guardian Council approved 7 candidates to run in the elections on June 17th. The dominant candidate who has been approved is Ebrahim Raisi, the head of Iran's judiciary, along with 7 other candidates. Women are not officially barred from running, and many put their names forward. Unfortunately, they were all rejected. Among others who were rejected, which was quite a surprise, was a former Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani, who is a conservative and was widely expected to be approved. The current Vice President, Esar Jahangiri, has also been barred from running. Among the candidates are Saeed Jalili, a former nuclear negotiator, Mohammad Reza, Mohsen Reza, a former Revolutionary Guards commander, Ali Reza Zakani, a former lawmaker, Amir Hossein Qazizadeh, a current lawmaker, Mohsen Mehr Alizadeh, a former provincial governor, and Abdul Hassan Abdul Nasser Himmati, the current head of Iran's central bank. As you can tell from their titles, none of them have a lot of political record. And it seems that the stage has been set up in a way so that Ebrahim Raisi, the head of the judiciary, will have an easy win. It's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers. I am the former New York Times correspondent based in Tehran, currently an MEI non-resident fellow. I'm going to introduce our speakers. Fatima Haqiqatjou is a very well-known name in the area of women's rights and Iran's politics. She's the director of Nonviolent Initiative for Democracy, or NID. She's an expert on Iran's internal affairs, democracy, women's rights, human rights, and she has served as a member of parliament in Iran. She was a reformist member from 2000 to 2004. She held academic positions at MIT, University of Connecticut, UMass, and Harvard University, as well as MIT, if I missed it. She has a PhD from Iran, and she was an assistant professor at Tehran University. Susanne Tahmasbi is also very well known among women and women activists. She's a director of Femina, an organization that supports human rights defenders, their organizations, and feminist movements in the MENA region. Femina is specially focused on contexts where civil society space is constrained. There is growing extremism, authoritarianism, and conflict. Susan has over 20 years of experience in promoting women's rights, peace, and security at the national and international levels. She has experience in building the capacity of civil society in Iran, and she was based in Iran from 1999 to 2011. Her work has focused on promoting women's rights, peace, and security in the broader MENA region. And Roya Borumand is the executive director of ABC. She has a PhD in international relations from France and is a specialist in Iran's post-Second World War history. She's a former consultant with the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch and has researched and written about women's rights and family law in North Africa. She has co-authored many articles on the political situation in Iran and the nature of Islamist terrorism. She's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post and has been recipient of the Leach Walesa Prize in 2009. Thank you so much for joining us. Fatima, let me start with you. What is going to be the ramification of This elections for women, considering the candidates who have been approved to run.
Morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Nazila, for this panel. So as you set up the stage with this candidate, and as you mentioned, it seems to me that Raisi will be next president of Iran, and as again you mentioned, Raisi's background is in judiciary, but I did a bit of research on his wife, Jamile Alamul Huda. Dr. Jamila Alamul Huda is faculty of Shahid Beheshti University, where was a university that I was also faculty in same school, but I never met her when I was there actually. But she is, if Raisi become president, she will be so-called, we don't say first lady in Iran, right? But she will be the first wife of president who is working and has a position. If we look at to her point of view, ideological point of view, she published a couple of books and several publication, and also she's a head of research center called Science, Fundamental Science and IT in the university, which is basically her main point is humanity, human sciences. Basically, we have two approach to human sciences, and that has to be that has to be Islamic. So also she's one of the people who support that. And on the previous election, she actually mentioned that this election, which her husband was a candidate, is about two views on women. Women with the view of feminism, Western women point of view, and women in Islam. And particularly, she said that in Islam, we don't have gender. We have coupleness, partnership, zawjiyat. I don't know if I am translating the word correctly to English. So basically, she denies independency of women, and she say that the women has to get alimony either from her husband, her father, or if the father is no father or husband, the estate is responsible to provide alimony. So of course, she is daughter of Ayatollah Alamul Huda, the Friday prayer in Mashhad, very influential person, and also wife of Raisi. So she grew up in a clergy household.
In
so
a very conservative one, right? One of the most
very
conservative.
So if she's educated, faculty member, have such a view, and she has been very influential in Office of Women Commission of the Revolutionary Cultural Revolution, Supreme Council of Cultural Revolution, شورای عالی انقلاب فرهنگی. So this is her ideology. So if we look at, and I know that she's very influential, and the model that we will see is similar to model we've seen during Ahmadinejad presidency, that immediately once they took the office, they changed even the name of the معاونت مرکز مشارکت امور زنان, which is Center for Women's Participation, to Women and Family. So in this perspective, if there is legislation, which is the parliament also is supportive of, will be supportive of this president, all we'll see is traditional notion of womanhood, women as a wife and women as a mother. And given the fact that Iran's population has been reduced, so I can imagine that basically to boost the population, while Rice is president, we may see that contraceptive won't be available, or because they want to increase the birth rate. And so I don't see a good perspective from the government side, but I am very optimistic, hopeful person, because I know that women's movement is very strong in Iran. Although we will have some restriction from the government side, but on the other hand, we'll see female entrepreneurship, because those are women. The new generation will be active in entrepreneurship board, they will be active in civil society, and of course they will be vocal to raise their concern about women's issue. That is my hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Fatemeh. This is a very helpful introduction, knowing Raisi's wife is going to be the first lady in Iran who actually has academic education and is a working woman. But sadly, she belongs to a thinking, a political thought that is very different than what the younger generation is interested in. Susan, women were a big political force. In 1997, they voted overwhelmingly for President, for Mohammad Khatami, who was a reformist candidate, and they remained a big political force. I know that you're following Iran's events very closely. What is your sense this time? Are they going to take part in the elections? What's happening?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nazila, for holding this event. It's a really rather continues to be a hopeless time, I think, but you know, I have hope that people will reorganize and rethink, come up with different strategies to come out of this rather difficult situation. So yes, so as you probably know, the last 2 months of leading up to the election, since the last 2 months, it's been extremely, the environment around the elections have been extremely active, specifically on Clubhouse, which was this new social medium that emerged, and Iranians took to it almost immediately, and they've had a lot of different conversations, much of them, and some of the most popular ones really focused on the elections. And before I go into that sort of describing that space, I want to sort of talk about a little bit about the different groups of women who have been talking about the elections, and basically the different groups of women generally vis-a-vis the elections. So there's a large population of Iranians, including women, who do not intend to vote. Some of them are actively participating in campaigns that call for non-participation in the elections, and they had been doing it, and this was their intention, no matter who was qualified to run for elections. So, for example, Mostafa Tajzadeh, who is a reformist, and he's a kind of more of a radical reformist who was looking for very serious structural change within the Iranian political system. And, his wife is also involved in the women's movement and advocating for women's rights. He had promised, although with no real detail, that he would work to address longstanding discrimination against women. This group would have not even voted for him. So the most, radical, sort of the most progressive reformists wouldn't have been able to gain the support of this group of women who were boycotting the elections. Then there's this whole group of people who they talk about as the gray vote. We don't really know what that gray vote is because nobody tends to break it down, but it's these people who, I think when reformists and when principalists, the conservatives talk about the gray vote, they always talk about this group that may or may not vote. That may or may not vote for them, but I like to divide them into more categories. So there are groups of people who probably will never vote, and it's not necessarily because of any campaign. That they might have issues with the Islamic Republic or just not be engaged. And there's groups that if they vote, they would vote for conservatives. If they vote, they would vote for reformists. And then each sort of group has their own constituency that if that they would vote for their respective candidates. So this is kind of the makeup of women who, the Iranian women and just Iranians in general who may or may not participate in elections. So I just want to say that with the ruling of the ruling that, the disqualification of pretty much all the reformist candidates, so a larger number of people have actually joined the groups that will not vote. So I think that this will be a very low turnout. And I think especially it'll probably be a very low turnout when it, concerning women. A lot of conversations were held on Clubhouse in the last couple of months. The majority of those conversations, especially by political figures and political groups, were focused on the political approach and political rights of Iranian citizens and what each candidate's plan was in terms of political reform and development of political freedoms and political rights. So much of the discussions by candidates did not include any real mention or any in-depth mention of women's rights. There were a couple of sessions that were held by reformists, including reformist women, on women in the elections. But unfortunately, it's really, really very unfortunate that even the reformist women are largely focused on women's share of the political pie. Then that this in and of itself means that women's issues will be tended to if they get nominated as ministers or the heads of high-level positions, as deputies, etc. So even for the women who were active and running, there was very little genuine and deep conversation about what would happen with even a reformist presidency and how they would go about addressing long-standing and very serious and deep-rooted discrimination against women in the Iranian legal system or in society, etc. Most of them would make blanket statements that we're going to address legal discrimination, but wouldn't go about how they're going to do it, because of course we know that this is not in the responsibility of the presidency. So I should say that a couple, I should also say one very hopeful thing that really emerged from these conversations on Clubhouse is that we saw a new generation of Iranian women, young Iranian women, who are involved in the political process, who are members of political parties, who, unlike their predecessors, older women in politics are in fact very, very vocal about discrimination against women and the need to reform it. And even some of them who are part of political parties called on women and, other older women politicians and said, you really have nothing to offer the Iranian public. And a few of them even announced that no matter who, even before the decision of the Guardian Council, that no matter who gets elected, that they're not going to vote. I should also mention that part of this non-vote campaign is not only, it's the presidency of Hassan Rouhani that, especially his second term, that left many people hopeless, but also the violent way in which protesters were cracked down in November following the protests with the increase in price, the price hike in gasoline. So a lot of people are boycotting, not only because Hassan Rouhani's presidency failed to offer them much of anything, but also because it took an extremely violent turn and has been cracking down not only on women, but broadly on civil society. So I want to make that clear. But I am hopeful about this new generation of Iranian women, and even some of you would see from time to time. I mean, I was mostly in the reformist room, I'll be frank with you, but even in the conservative rooms, from time to time, you would see women who would come up, younger women who wouldn't necessarily criticize or push for the very traditional viewpoints on women. I mean, I don't think their perspectives are necessarily for elimination of all forms of discrimination, but they too, I see, are critical and do vocalize some level of support for reforming laws and allowing for women's progress. So that's the smallest sliver of hope that I see going into the future. That unlike their predecessors, who may believe in women's rights and equality, but are very fearful of vocalizing it for backlash because it's taboo, because it means that they'll be marginalized from the political process, this younger generation is very adamant that they're going to talk about women's rights, and it's going to be a big part of their political participation.
Interesting. Roya, Susan pointed to a very valid point that a lot of women are saying that the president doesn't have the power to improve things for women, or he can't. And I know you've been following some of the discussions on Clubhouse. What are some of the big obstacles? I mean, does it make any difference who becomes president for women when it comes to increasing their rights and freedoms?
Yes, thank you. I have been roaming in Clubhouse rooms, and at the detriment of everything else that needs to be done. But it has been fascinating, as Susan said. It has been fascinating in the sense that there is a lot more truth-telling going on. And I think that a part of the problem, women's rights, one thing, the revolution has been a serious legal setback for women. There is no doubt there. And it has reinforced the culture, the existing culture that wanted women at home as mothers and as wives. So, but one thing Iranian women cannot be accused of is not trying. Right? They have tried where they had the possibility to. They have adjusted to the level of repression and used their resourcefulness and persistence to push, whether they are in the circles of power or they are the outsiders, which the majority of Iranians are outsiders in the division of insider and outsider of the regime. So, all these, they have fought discrimination in the law. They have tried to mobilize general public, bring about cultural change. They have tried to vote and use the reformists in the ruling elite to push for their agenda. They have used foreign resources like the NGOs outside the country, the media, the think tanks outside the country to push the government for change. So they have resorted to everything. And if you look at the legal changes that we've seen in the past couple of decades, if we just go back a couple of decades, whether it's raising the minimum age of maturity and the minimum age of marriage, or stopping violence against women, or impacting in a noticeable way the family law, the gains are not huge, and there are always such loopholes. Even when we get some reform, there are such loopholes that basically judges can do whatever they want. And Raisi is a big concern because he is a good soldier. He has made his way. His career path is paved with dead bodies, whether he was a prosecutor or, in the 80s, or a judge, participating in the 1988 massacre, or being deputy chief justice in charge of deciding whether drug offenders would be pardoned or not. When they didn't have appeals, thousands and thousands of people were executed. So, what women, some of the women I've talked to, and some of the women who have been active for a long time, and the ones who have been persecuted more recently, whether it's because they challenged the compulsory bail or other reasons, or, I can give you example of people who had workshops for, to help women think about the terms of the marriage in their marriage contract, or the woman who has applied for to register an NGO to empower women, and who has been sentenced to 4 years, even though her application was rejected. Like, just the thought of, they see the problem as it is, which is that the Constitution allows, emphasizes that the right of women must be ensured in conformity with Islamic criteria. And who is determining what this Islamic criteria is are basically 6 clerics chosen by the leader. And who decides whether or not women are acting against Islamic criteria and punishing them is a judiciary run by a chief justice chosen by the supreme leader. So women have tried and through different ways, and they keep hitting this wall of laws, and none of what is happening to them is illegal per se. I mean, I know that Iranian lawyers try to find, language in the law to say that the women are persecuted and others are persecuted illegally. But the fact of the matter is that as long as legal and illegal is interpreted based on some vague Islamic criteria, we are stuck. And women are saying, we've tried it all. Now, it's time to look at the facts. And the facts are that as long as we have the Council of Guardians and we have these vague notions of Islamic criteria in the Constitution, progress is going to be what it is. If you look at the report to the UN, a report to the UN by the Iranian government regarding the Beijing agenda, and the platform in 2003, in 42 pages, women equality is mentioned twice, 3 times if we count the title. The 2019 report to the UN for the Universal Periodic Review mentions women 66 times. Equality is not mentioned once. What I mean is that, yes, there have been a lot of developments. The society has evolved, mostly thanks to women themselves, to communication. There are a lot of issues, and to women within the system who have tried to push here and there. But the problem is that those women, and I've been listening to the Clubhouse, to the reformist, the women who have been in the government, Mrs. Ebtekar, who actually talks like a Soviet Politburo apparatchik. And I fall asleep when she talks because, it keeps like dragging and dragging. But, everyone talks about issues. Even the veil issue has become, electoral Obnabat, suite that is held over to get women to vote. But none of them is talking about how. So they are talking about what they want to do, but they're not talking about how they want to do it, because they don't know how they will do it. And when one of these women was challenged, what have you done to engage with the Council of Guardian about women, about discrimination? The only thing that was in the response is that we have talked about women, the issue of women being able to run for president. Well, trust me that a woman president will not be able to do much, except being very frustrated.
Yeah, interesting points, Roya. So the obstacles are huge, legal obstacles, the Constitution and the Civil Code, they're all huge obstacles.
Islam, the big elephant in the room is Islam in the law. I mean, we have to say it. I know that it's not always politically correct to talk about, the fact that religion has to be surgically removed from the law. Otherwise, there will be always, old bearded turbaned man deciding for women who have nothing to do with their lifestyle.
Yeah. Fatima, I want to combine that with a question that we've got about Iranian women activists and how they feel about the changes in Saudi Arabia. And I'm throwing this question at you because you and I are old enough to remember the days after the revolution and how things dramatically changed for women. But then again, we have lived with different generations of women who came of age and they became feminists and activists. But over the past, I would say 10 years, 15 years, I haven't monitored Iranian women activists that closely. But not only their tones have changed, but women have had different tools and platforms at their disposal to move forward with their demands and to accomplish what they want to accomplish. I mean, they didn't sit there, wait for the regime to give them more rights and provide an opportunity for them. Can you tell us what has happened over the past 10, 15 years after 2009 uprising, when there was, one of the largest crackdowns. And then of course we had other bloody crackdowns against protesters, whether women or they were men. How has the tone changed? How are women reacting to improvements in even Saudi Arabia?
Very interesting point you mentioned. I think Islamic Republic has had one positive thing for women, and that was rate of education, which is, I guess I understand it's across the Middle East and across the world. Gender gap in education has been closed, and of course, Islamic Republic is no things, but so if we in maybe in social issue, if we compare women, see differences there, especially in Saudi Arabia. You know that in Saudi Arabia there have been several ambassadors, including female ambassador to the United States, which is very important, and female entrepreneurship has been high in Saudi Arabia, this is also another important point. And even I think, like when we look at to the Iraq and Afghanistan after the regime change, we see that women in government have been visible, even though we don't know what will happen in Afghanistan after current political development, which is concerning for women. So these changes that we've seen in neighborhood, so I think that also give another point to Iranian women to compare. Not only they feel, experience discrimination, they compare it with like other Middle Eastern country or other country around them, and that has been another layer to understand where they stand. So as social media has been an important tool, women have been using social media greatly to raise their concern, stand up, speak. And I think in one sense, while I agree with both panelists, but I think women themselves have been able to actually to give a voice to women's concern in society that most politicians address it in one way or in another. Even a conservative politician have to say something about women's issue, even though they may put it based on their ideology. As I mentioned, to say more about womanhood, being wife, being mother, emphasizing on family as a value, but still, I think these demands have been great and has its own impact. If we look at with presidential election, we are going to have city council election, which that is also an important point because councils will be formed at the level of village, cities around the country, and women have been active, even though it's a bit surprise. Still, the rate of even registration is not high. Only 6% of women registered as a candidate out of 296,000 people who registered as a candidate.
How does it compare to previous town council elections? Has the number dropped?
No, number was almost similar. So 17,885 women registered. And out of these, 6,743 women are going, actually registered for city council, and over 11,000 women for villages. Okay. And in villages, women somehow have a higher chance. We have like over, I think over 2,000 women who runs villages, and this is very important. Some provinces, rate of women's participation in some provinces have been greater, such as Sistan and Baluchistan, which is Sunni province, and this Sistan Baluchistan has been greater in and other couple of provinces. Women have been active. This is important for me because they can change for several reasons. First, they can change attitude of population, that women can bring change. Second, they, Iran corruption rate is so high, and women were less corrupted in compare to men, and they have been active in some of these councils that, let's say, still they are in minority in council. Councils depend on the city size. In villages, councils are 3-member councils, but in cities depend on the size of the city. It starts from 3 ends to 21-member council for Tehran. So even though women were minority, some of these women were able to be head of the councils, and also this shows their capacity. They have done great job at the level of municipality. So they will practice some sort of local leadership, and they will be identified. Always I say, this is again my hope and optimism, that once women become community leaders now, if a real change come to the country, these female community leaders will play much of important and stronger role in future of Iran. Remember, if we look at 2 countries such as Egypt, after this Arab Spring things, because there was a gap of power, conservative could took the government. But if we put energy and time to empower women at the level of civil society, they get offered tools, expertise, skills. They can be useful. They can organize community now and later. And again, this is the hope side for me. And believe or not, the population, including and mostly women, are more advanced than the government. This is why we see Iranian are more vocal, because they are advanced compared to their rulers.
Yeah. And that's what Susan has been doing, capacity building on civil society level. Susan, what has Raisi done to attract women's votes, or has he done anything? Does he have an agenda at all?
You are muted.
Oh, just to clarify, this is what I did in Iran when I was in Iran. I did capacity building, not what I'm doing now. So I want to clarify it because there's a lot of sensitivity, and I don't want it to be misleading. So when I was in Iran, we worked on capacity building, and I was also part of the women's movement. I want to answer, if it's okay, I want to just respond to a couple of comments that were made before. First of all, I think it's really important to sort of say that this is not the conservative viewpoint on women. It's the viewpoint of the Islamic Republic on women that Fatima talked about. It's the concept of complementarity, that men and women are different based on biological differences, and they have different roles that are complementary, that complement one another, and based on that understanding, they should have different rights. So this is the issue that Iranian women have been challenging from day one in whatever way and capacity they could have, and they are. So the principalist or the conservative camp is actually very true and committed to this concept, whereas the reformists have been challenging it, but they're afraid to challenge it very vocally and very publicly. So we know very well what the conservatives want, what they will do when they go into power. It's to reinforce this concept in whatever way they can. But we're not so sure of the reformists because they're afraid to talk about what they will do. And there will be a difference between governments. If you have a government that's committed to women's rights, even if they can't change the law, if there's very little they can do other things like dedicate funding to certain programs like empowerment, making sure that, that the registration of NGOs and organizations is eased up, that they allow for people to engage in civil society. I don't think that women need to be empowered to work in civil society. I think the Iranian women, and especially the ones in the women's movement, are pretty empowered already. They don't have space. They've been cracked down on consistently. We only had a very small opening of window where women could organize, and it was during Khatami's time, which were the first time they could organize independent women. I'm not talking about religious women. Yeah, religious state women have been organizing and they've been advancing from the start, and some of them ended up being critical of the system that they worked with, which is great. It opened up space for the rest of us. But independent women, people, who are not part of the religious system or not part of the government, had a very small window of opportunity to organize in NGOs. That's the period following that, during Ahmadinejad's time, where we had serious repression and crackdown on the women's movement. We had when women could actually fight that back during that time, that repression, because they had this small opportunity of 5 or 6 years under Khatami where they were able to actively engage in social activities and strengthen themselves. So I wanted to sort of put that in there. And I think that, the problem with the reformist presidential candidates is they weren't willing to talk about the challenges they faced to eliminate it. They would make these broad statements like, we'll eliminate discrimination against women, but how? If you can't change the law, then what is your plan? Are you going to dedicate funding to it? Are you going to deal with it in the employment sector and the job market? Are you going to have special programs for women? Are you going to give directives to the provinces that they work to empower women through these policies or not? So nobody was willing to go down any further, and that's the problem. And just on the region, I want to say, yes, Saudi Arabia, I think initially when Saudi Arabia announced its reforms, there were a lot of people who are opposed to the Islamic Republic who really used it. And unfortunately, women's status is always used as a political bat, I think. It's not without consideration of what it means for women to hit your political opponent. So, look at what Saudi Arabia is doing. But I think that the people in the women's movement very fully understand that, while these may help women, that it's a top-down measure, and that at the very same time that these reforms are being adopted, there is incredible and unprecedented crackdown on women activists in Saudi Arabia. And it basically is saying, you know what, I am the benevolent leader. I am going to give you what I want to give you. You have no say about it. And if you make a demand, your place is in jail and you're a terrorist. And in fact, Iranian women, especially Iranian women's movement, have been following the crackdown against women activists in Saudi Arabia and have been campaigning along with them. Every time that you see, some news about Saudi Arabia and the rest of the region, the Iranian women's movement is also amplifying that, translating information about what's happening, because this crackdown is regional. It's not just in Iran, it's really happening in the region, and we have to be aware of it. And we're not only losing ground on women's ability to organize, but we're losing ground on women's rights. There's pushback in places like Egypt and pushback in places like Turkey, on women's rights, and also in Iran. So I think in terms of Raisi's presidency, but we're going to see more of the same that we've seen from conservatives. We have a very conservative, very, I would say, regressive parliament in power now that's pushing back on women's rights. So during Ahmadinejad's period, there was, when we had the first and only female minister, who was the Minister of Health, and she was a doctor of gynecology, if I'm not mistaken. Huh? Yes. Yes. And under her directorship, or under her watch, I would say, perhaps she, a very stringent family, a pro-natalist policy was adopted that goes against the one thing that, had huge development achievements for Iran and Iranian women, is the birth rate. We had an incredibly successful family planning program in Iran that was dismantled, and it wasn't implemented during Hassan Rouhani's period. And I think that there was a lot of resistance in the Ministry of Health with the first health minister, who was progressive, and I think under Mullah Verdi there was resistance, until there was actually directive and an order from the very top that this policy has to be implemented, and it has been implemented to the detriment of women. So basically, there's no free family planning services, no free contraceptives, you can't have vasectomies, you can't tie your tubes, and serious crackdown on abortion, right? So there was very limited abortion for women. Under special circumstances, that's being cracked down. Illegal abortion has always been rampant. That's being cracked down about. And this parliament is now putting forward a bill that's extremely problematic, preventing women from getting prenatal testing. So, we're going to see much more of the same kind of policies that seek to control women's bodies more aggressively. And, while we've had very little legal changes over the last 40 years, we've had some, and they're very minor, but I think given the hurdles, they're still very significant. And, given the resistance, it's significant. I think we're going to see similar and much more attempt on women's gains. So we haven't had legal gains, but we've had a lot of social gains. So women in universities, the low birth rate, the increase in age of marriage. So the real age of marriage is, the legal age of marriage is 13, but women are getting married at 25, 27, right? So we're going to see a lot of policy proposals that are going to target women's gains that women themselves have made based on taking advantages of limited opportunities. And my last comment here is going to be about Raisi's wife. This came up in the last presidential elections, that he talked about how his wife went and got in a debate, how his wife went and got a PhD. And he said, well, she asked me and I said, okay. And she went and did this. And, the reformists were making fun of him, which was really very, very offensive to women. And I actually tweeted about this to one of the reformist candidates who was making fun of this. Oh, I let my wife go. Because the reality is, in the law, that's what you have to do. The law gives the man the power to say yes or no. Granted, perhaps, hopefully, many Iranians are much more progressive and the law is behind them. But the reality is you can't make fun of that, because that's the law, and it's the law that all of these men, so it's that same, that when the bat with which they hit their opponent, but they're not really committed to those principles. And the problem also is that, I think it's the positive thing is that if in Raisi's household, his wife and the daughter of this ultra conservative man who just is not at all committed to women's rights, is a PhD and is teaching at universities, it shows that even in their families, women are pushing back these red lines. But unfortunately, it's only good for their families. They're not, in the public, in the political sphere, they're still advocating for these extremely regressive laws, trying to push women out of universities, trying to push them back in the home. And then they have these awful women legitimizing these claims. Okay, so you want women to stay home? Why don't you stay home? That's so I'm sorry, I got a little, but really,
thank you.
So I think we're going to see during Raisi's presidency, and he, you know, supposedly he has a 7,000-page manifesto, but nobody's seen it about his plan. There's one other
that may or may not include anything about women.
I think it'll be this. So there's another conservative candidate, which in Clubhouse somebody was saying that actually he comes from a progressive family and it's kind of ridiculous, and he's actually put forth his Ghazizadeh Hashemi, he's put forth his presidential plan, and I just looked it up, and 2 mentions of women, only twice women are mentioned, and basically he says is to restore the dignity of the family, or to look at women squarely, you know, to put at the center the family again. So it's really defining only women's roles as mothers, as wives, within the family, which means that women are going to be pushed even more out of the workforce. With Corona, women have already been pushed, Corona, the poor economic situation, sanctions, they've already been pushed out of the workforce even more. The very small gains they've had, they've lost, and they haven't been able to recover. So just in the first 6 months of Corona, women lost something like 700,000 jobs, which is significant. It's like 13% of their employment, only 5 women are working. Yes, and men lost similar number, but they started regaining. Women have continued to decline. So this is really problematic. With a poor economic situation, it's going to justify further that men as head of households, they should be working and women shouldn't be working. So I think we have really difficult times ahead policy-wise for women. And there's going to be huge crackdown, I think, on civil society, even further crackdown. We've had that in Rouhani's time as well.
Roya, what do you think was the impact of regime crackdown on the recent protests? I mean, not recent, the ones over the past couple of years, they've been quite bloody. How does it impact turnout?
You know, before I get to that, I have to say that part of the problem is also that the members of the ruling elite, whether they are reformers or not, come more or less from the same cultural background. You know, they are not that different, and you know, we can say that yes, you know, in their families things have improved, that there is more participation. I mean, I have no doubt that this revolution has been good for women in the most traditional conservative part of the Iranian population, but that doesn't mean that they understand. I mean, before the revolution, women had made gains that even in 1924, our first criminal code considered anyone under the age of 18, boy and girl, as a child. And this was approved by Ayatollah Modarres. And so, you know, all of the gains were, you know, down the drain. And the fact that some of the men in the ruling elite are, you know, talking or seem more progressive, or doesn't mean that they believe. Actually, in Clubhouse, you had this discussion about the fact that, you know, okay, there are more women in managerial positions in the government under Rouhani, like there are deputy governors, for example. And what happens is that a man who is named deputy governor, this is a first step to progress and going up in the, you know, in the ranks of the ruling, you know, in the government. But for women, this is it. You know, there is no more. And, you know, it seems like when they have these managerial positions, there's a resentment. And, you know, I remember also a discussion after the reformists during the Khatami, after the Khatami era, after the 16th parliament. Sorry, I confuse the numbers. But the reformist parliament, there was like a little brainstorming get together of women deputies, and they were complaining that they, you know, men in the parliament didn't let them, you know, travel, didn't let them be as good as they can be. And the only thing that has kept women in the system is that they work hard and they are more competent than the men. You know, oftentimes they are more prepared, they work harder, and men need them because they are the ones who are doing the work. But that said, you know, these and the crackdown, you know, the pattern of the crackdown that I have documented over decades is that when groups become effective and they start to impact the population, they are cracked down on them. So it's not because of this government or this government. The system has a logic, which is to prevent civil society and prevent citizens, ordinary citizens, from being organized and impacting society. And so, so that is what these last protests and whatever Iran has gone through over the last few years has changed, is that it has brought together this intense persecution and these deadly crackdowns have brought women, have increased the number of people who are seeking justice, right? So you have the mothers and the sisters and the other family members. You have the women who have been put to jail because they are fighting against the capital punishment or because they took off their veil, right? And so it's very diverse, economically very diverse. People whose children have been killed are now used to be the constituency, the mustazafin, the downtrodden, the constituency of the regime. And now these women and the women who are fighting for women's rights and the journalists and all of these suddenly are getting together to seek justice because they all are experiencing injustice, right? And so, and as you know, panelists talked about, this is a different era. I mean, you know, women come to Clubhouse and say, you know, you guys have always are talking, you are invited and interviewed. We never have, you know, the possibility of speaking. And I say, you know, when I was your age, no one listened to me either. I mean, it took hard work for us to be even acknowledged, let alone be brought to talk publicly. And but these women, they don't want to necessarily wait for doing the hard work and eventually being acknowledged. They want to have to say what they want. And I think it's not even proper to Iran in this generation. They are very demanding, much more demanding. And I hope for them that this way of behaving will get them further than it got us. But so yes, now, you know, and there is a very clear mistrust, the mistrust about any good coming from the Islamic Republic. And I think that's what is new in a way, because yes, political groups that were not allowed in the system, that were persecuted, had always this mistrust. But, you know, the general mistrust about the fact that we have been fooled and fooled and fooled, and look where we are, and we get killed because we protest the price of the gas, or, you know, for very benign things, we get killed. So, yes, so that's how it has. I think there is a new solidarity among people that is basically the doing of repression, you know, that has brought people with very different political views together. And, you know, one of the symptoms of that was the hashtag Don't Execute, when the sentences of the 3 protesters, 2017 protesters, came out, or around Navid Afkari. You know, these are things that we never saw before. I mean, yes, there was a specialized activism over these issues, but, you know, I'm an anti-death penalty activist, and I was stunned. You know, we haven't even seen this outside Iran, you know, anywhere. So yes, I think these protests have brought women together around, you know, the agenda that this is not good, but that's, you know, there is no demand. So for now, you know, it's rejection. What I hope is that this rejection will also translate at some point in concrete demands.
Thank you. I want to go back to Susan's point about the conservatives limiting education to their own families. We have a question from one of our audience. She's referring to a rumor that Larijani was disqualified because her daughter is studying in England, in Britain. So I want to make sure that I am getting to all the questions because we have some very interesting ones here. If you have any comments about that, I know that was as far as a rumor that even some of the newspapers raised. If you have any further information, please go ahead and add. But we have two very interesting and somehow related questions. One comment and question is that, well, systematic education for women started in Iran since 1907. It was a policy that was continued after the revolution. And in 1944, actually, education for women became compulsory. I know education became compulsory. I'm not sure if it included women as well, but that was education for women was not a new thing after the revolution. So please, any of you, if you have any comment on that, we have only about 6 more minutes left. And then one question about Iran being appointed to UN's Women's Rights Commission. Why was that? I mean, that was a very strange vote.
So
I can take
Yes,
that.
Roya, please go ahead.
The second one.
Yes.
Well, so, the Ayatollah Khamenei has had a much more organized way of looking at things and much more global view of doing things. And so in the past 15 years, we have seen a much more aggressive policy towards influencing international bodies. And Iran over the years, so the Human Rights Council or headquarters in Farsi, their mission is, which is not actually translated into English, even though a lot of other things are translated into English, is that one of their main goals is to influence the UN and the international community about the fact that human rights are not universal. And this is what they're doing. And there has been millions spent for Iran to have groups and to have organized activities to influence the international community and convince them of cultural relativism and about the fact that human rights should be adapted, and that, in Iran, human rights will be different from the US or somewhere else. And so part of this is to push and get into, so Iran, has been trying to get into UN Women. I think they got in 2011. The first time, which was stunning. I even wrote a piece about it because it was just so stunning. Then they pushed to get into the UNODC, and they want to get into Human Rights Council, and there they are very active. They engage. They used to, in the 80s, they would say, we don't kill 12-year-olds, but even if we do, it's not your business, right? But now, they engage, they come and have conversations, and it's always the same thing, theoretical, and it goes on and on and on. And at the end, it's about, that our women are happy with the Sharia law and we are taking care of them, and on other, the death penalty, which is not true, actually. The death penalty for children is not approved in Iran, even in religious circles. The fact that a 9-year-old is criminally responsible is absurd. And so that's what they've been doing. And, with some success, I have to say. And they are supported by China, who is doing the same thing, and the Saudis in that matter, and all the people who don't want to respect the rights of their people, like this approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just add on that, because I think it's important. I think we shouldn't emphasize the role of Iran. This really is a global movement to push back on rights for different reasons, because part of it is religious. So we have, for example, the Holy See, which is I don't even know why they have a membership. They're not, in the in the UN. They're pushing back. Russia is pushing back. China is pushing back. All these, Islamic countries that don't get along on other issues, they get along very well on women's issues, the definition of the family, so sexual orientation and gender equality rights. So Trump administration, for example, was a very active member. They worked very closely. There are a lot of, if Iran has gongos, there are a lot of US-based gongos who come at this from a very, religious and ideological perspective. A lot of the Latin American countries, because of the Catholic Church, all of this. So they actually collaborate very well at the international level. It's not just about Iran or Islamic countries. It's a lot of Christian countries that are actively pushing back on women's gains, and some countries do it because of sovereignty issues, but some do it based on ideological issues. And the Commission on the Status of Women.
Let me say that this is true, but not in the US or some of the other countries.
No, the US did it during Trump's administration.
But they don't silence the voices that are opposed to them.
No, but they give special advantage to really problematic groups. Like they took groups of very anti-women, sexual and gender orientation rights group, only group that they took as part of their delegation to the Commission on the Status of Women, which meant that they influenced the US position on this. So it is I think we would be amiss to say this is an Iran thing. It is a global trend, and they're all pushing back on women's rights. And to give you an example, I'm just going to do this. The Commission on the Status of Women, it doesn't really have much right. They have a meeting every year. They issue a statement that's non-binding, and the fight in that statement is on wording. Like, should it be early marriage, child marriage? This is what they fight on the definition of a family, because they're afraid that if that wording is reduced, they're going to lose footing in places like the Human Rights Council, for example. And that statement is non-binding. So
Suzanne, we have only one more minute left. I'm very sorry for interrupting you.
It's a global movement against rights. So
yeah, Fatima, I want to give you the final 1 minute just to conclude on the education question, that it was something that started before the revolution.
First of all, Alir Larijani's daughter is in the United States on H-1 visa, as the family gave the information. So on education, the constitutional revolution, while happening, women demanded education for girls. And so I think at that point that wasn't approved, but later this was a success. So women's movement has started, 1906, continued, and we see progress, at least in the education section.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. We will continue this conversation, and I look forward to having you back here after we know the results of the election.
Thank you so much.
Maybe we can talk about some other, not the elections, but some